Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Mike Shelby.
Okay. All right. There we go. Muted. Where was I? Welcome to Out Front. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. I don't know how that got remuted. Today, we're jumping back into this book, Grasshoppers and Elephants. It's been a good book so far. I'm going to be talking about the strategic importance of morale and also talk about some intelligence stuff and some other things that were going on in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, according to this book. Very interesting stuff. Plenty of lessons learned for us. But first, let me tell you a quick story. I went and had my weekly coffee with veterans, and it's hard to believe that there's still World War II veterans out there, but there are. And it's been really great just going over the past several weeks, listening to those stories. Like I was talking to a guy today. He was a radio operator on a submarine, and he was in the Pacific, like somewhere in the vicinity during the attack on Hiroshima. And it's just interesting listening to these guys talk about where they were and what they did. And it's not just World War II veterans. There's also Korea and Vietnam veterans as well. One of the questions of this, first of all, this guy's like, I don't know, he's got to be, if he's not 100, he's dang close, maybe over 100 by now. But one of the guys asked him, how was the coffee aboard the submarine? And he thought for a second. He said, well, it was always ready. So apparently not that good. By the way, old people love talking about the weather, and just so happens, it's been pretty hot here in Central Texas. And one of the guys, I mean, you know how it is, like, how's the weather, kind of small talk stuff at first. And another old guy, another World War II vet, said, oh, it's not too hot in the morning. And, we thought, oh yeah, that's a good point. He's like, yeah, it feels great starting about 7 a.m. in the morning, feels great till about 7:30 in the a.m. And I don't know, he told a lot funnier than that. But listen, go to these American Legion, VFW, wherever you're, the local coffee shop, wherever these guys are hanging out, and just listen to their stories, because just a very good reminder. There's a long line of guys who went and fought in far worse conflicts than anyone younger today. And just, it's Dustin and I were talking about, the show. It's like, it's hard to believe, like in Iraq or Afghanistan, like, 10, 20 dead in one attack is bad, like real bad. And in Vietnam, you get like, hundreds of guys dying in a single battle, or, maybe more than that. And Dustin's absolutely right. The past couple of generations, we have just not experienced casualties on that level. And it really makes you wonder, how deep does American commitment go to a high-end conventional conflict with, a near peer adversary? Let's just say China. How many Americans are going to be coming back in body bags until the United States of America starts saying, why are we fighting over Taiwan? And it's kind of the same problem that, China knows it's a problem. I think the U.S. administration knows it's a problem. Maybe it's one reason why we don't get into a high-end conventional conflict with China. At any rate, let's pick back up on the talking points about morale, because just like we saw during the entirety of the GWAT, I'm sure the United States government is going to be spending heavily to try to boost morale. Like, at the NFL games, they started playing after 9/11, they started playing the national anthem, and he had the flyovers and the B-2 bombers or whatever they are, and the Blue Angels and all that stuff, right? I mean, that's just morale. It's pro-American rah-rah cheerleading. And the point is that morale is not just important in warfare. It's not just important if you're the United States government trying to sell the citizens a war, but really living through any kind of emergency or any protracted ordeal, especially a conflict, you have to remain positive and optimistic. There was that really good quote about the importance of remaining realistic, but also being optimistic that you can win, or don't confuse your optimism to win with the ability of what you're about to undertake, or I don't know, something like that. At any rate, winning in our case, for me, if I had to define victory, it's surviving through whatever's going to happen this decade and or next decade, and then building something better in the future than what we have today. And anything short of that, I think, will be a net loss for me personally. So I came across this section of the book about the importance of morale, and I'll read. This is from a North Vietnamese officer, and he was asked what was the low point of their multi-decade conflict. Because remember, back in the 1940s, they're fighting the French, and then they turn around and they're also in Indochina. They're also fighting the Japanese. Then they turn around and they fought the Americans, and they turn around and fought the South Vietnamese to take over South Vietnam and Saigon. They also, someone over on Twitter, they said, hey, they also fought against the Cambodians and deposed Pol Pot. And then they turned around and fought this border skirmish with the Chinese. So actually, the Viet Minh / Viet Cong / North Vietnamese are 6-0. As far as I'm concerned, at least modern history, 6-0 in conflicts against everybody. At any rate, here is what this North Vietnamese officer had to say. He said the most difficult period of this conflict was from 1962 to 1963, and here is what he described. Quote, our equipment and military technique were very low. We didn't have real arms, only dummy rifles, hose, and all sorts of rudimentary weapons. We started to produce some clumsy grenades and mines, enough for the type of weapons then being used against us. Then the enemy started using helicopters, which could spot hideouts and movements from the air, and amphibian tanks, which could swim across to some of our safest base areas. Let me stop there. Remember, a guerrilla base area should be secluded and difficult to get to. It should be so difficult to get to that no infantry troop says, yeah, I want to climb up that hill, or yeah, I want to walk 15 miles through this swamp, or whatever. The strategic bases of these base areas have to be secluded. The terrain has to favor the defender, and it's just got to be one hellacious trip to get out there. If they're doing guerrilla warfare correctly. At any rate, he said, so they had these amphibious tanks, which could make it out to their safe base areas, like really in the swamp is what they're talking about. Back in the swamp, which again is difficult to get through. He said, this caught us off balance for a time. We learned to make some primitive anti-tank mines from exploded bombs and shells and hit back. But the difficulties of 1962 to 1963 were very great and overcome only by a disciplined spirit of struggle. And this is Mao and Giap both talk about this repeatedly in their literature on the topic of guerrilla warfare. And they say morale is one of the most important things you can have. And yesterday we talked about the propaganda brigades, and that I'm sure that is another chief task of the propaganda brigades, is also propagandizing your own troops and indoctrinating your own troops and getting them into a fighting spirit, and make sure they continue to have a fighting spirit. There's also a section in this book where he talks about how this idea. Here I'll go over this next thing. Here, this North Vietnamese officer continues. After the first sparks of spontaneous resistance in widely separated areas of the country had led to a decision to launch generalized armed resistance, armed groups of differing size and quality sprang into being almost simultaneously all over the country. And this is, you go back to like Che Guevara, and he had this thing called FOCO theory. And he thought, according to the FOCO theory, which I don't agree with, he said, look, you don't need popular support at first. You just go and attack. And it's like propaganda by deed. Once the people who are angry, once they see that there is an alternative government capable of winning, they will join your side. And I don't think that's the case at all. Um, but this is not what happened in Indochina or in Vietnam, because they had, I mean, the people were well propagandized. So we have to start thinking about the mental state, the psychological state as shaping operations, right? Typically, you think about shaping operations as something physical, something that takes place on the battlefield. Well, in low intensity conflict, when part of the battlefield is on the mental plane, we think about, okay, now there's psychological shaping operations, there's informational shaping operations. How do we get these people to believe what we want them to believe? And then once that happens, now we're free to, move about the country or whatever. Now we're free. Now we have more leeway, maybe even more support with our operations once we can psychologically condition these people. And it's actually quite a lot to think about when you consider all the psychological conditioning that's been happening over the past several years. I mean, this goes back, it goes back all the way to 9/11 at least. That's kind of when I first started noticing. It's like, yeah, actually, there's quite a bit of propaganda floating around here, and really on both sides. But I want to really focus right now on this concept of acts of spontaneous resistance. By the way, there's some questions in the chats I'll get to here. When basically when he's talking about how they had this essentially a regular army of North Vietnamese troops, and they started attacking the French. And he just said, hey, these platoons started popping up all over North Vietnam. And I thought about that, and I said, what would be the trigger for this to happen in the United States? Has this ever happened before in the United States? Yes, it has. On both sides. Not quite to the level yet of the North Vietnamese fighting against the French. But, we go back to the summer of 2020, and I will say the protests were somewhat spontaneous, although I do believe there's quite a bit of probably centralized effort to push those protests. But the whole point is they popped up all over the country. And this also happened on the right. I remember back several years ago when Mike Glover made that initial YouTube video, at least the first one that I saw. And that's the whole thing that kind of birthed the American contingency. And all this, man, those started popping up all over the place. And I started seeing hats, and I started, there's all these meetups and people linking up. So this whole idea that you could not have spontaneous gatherings of people all across the country on either the left or the right, the idea that you could not have that holds no water, because we have seen that to a much lesser degree. It just has not progressed to the organized political violence yet. But I do think that could happen if there were a trigger. If there were a trigger strong enough, we know that social bases can spontaneously organize, because they've done this twice now. Twice pretty much within a year of each other, both on the left and the right. I do think, depending on the trigger, I do think we are potentially one all call away from the same thing happening in the United States, but potentially this time involving organized political violence, which is not mob violence. Organized political violence, I'm talking about, coordinated acts. So back to the story here. These platoons went from having garden hose and flintlock rifles to having a full complement of arms. And I want to describe how this happened, because one, I think this is a fallacy, but one thing I see propagated a lot, especially on the right, is how poorly armed the left is in this country. Like, if there were to be, if the left wing were to spearhead any kind of organized political violence, a bunch of people say, well, what are they going to do? Use their pink wigs and dildos, or whatever. That's what some people say, and I think that's inaccurate. Number one, a big part of the shortage of firearms and ammunition in this country, yeah, it was production, somewhat on the production side, supply side. The other part was demand. And the past several years, demand has not come only from the right. There's also been a lot of demand on the left. And so, the left is better armed than they were 3 years ago, far better armed. And even when I was tracking kind of day to day the armed leftist groups, they started out. I've told this story, I don't know, dozens of times. Seems like they started out when I'd see pictures posted on their little social media things. It was like grandpa's shotgun and a bolt action rifle. That was their starting point. And there would be these pictures, and not even all of them would have rifles. They'd be like taking turns shooting a rifle. And now that's not the case at all. Now you see these pictures and they've got full kits. I mean, they got plate carriers, they got magazines. You can look at their, chest rig or look at their, battle belt or whatever they have and say, yeah, all the furniture is in the right place. Whoever put that together either watched a really good YouTube video, or maybe they have local. Actually, not maybe, they absolutely do have local advisors. As a matter of fact, I do know of one former special forces soldier who is on the left and who is actively training. He's acting as cadre for some of these groups. And, we still track some of this stuff too over at Forward Observer. There's a lot of left wing firearms courses all across the country. There are a lot of efforts to build a gun culture on the left. That was one of the big things after George Floyd, is that you had a lot of these pro-gun leftist revolutionary groups saying, we have to build a gun culture. At any rate, even if it were the case, by the way, I think the left is far behind the right in terms of how well armed they are. But I do want to point out that they have made giant leaps in closing that gap. The gap's nowhere close to being closed, but they are working at it. This is from the same North Vietnamese officer, and he's talking about how poorly armed they were back in the beginning and how well equipped they became in just a short few years. He said, quote, even when we started to expand, so he's talking about expanding from like platoons to companies to battalions. He says, even when we started to expand, we only had about 10 firearms for each platoon. Now, an American, like an Army platoon, is doctrinally somewhere between 14 to 40 troops. So I don't know, let's just call it 20 to 40 troops roughly, probably on the North Vietnamese side. So about 10 firearms for maybe 20 to 40 troops. He continues, quote, during the first months, when we made attacks, for every man with a weapon, there was always one unarmed man ready to snatch a rifle from the enemy or from our own dead and wounded. And how many of you, as I read this, I thought, how many Americans today on the left or the right would venture out to fight against the French or venture to fight? And by the way, the French were no slouch in Indochina. Technically, I mean, they killed a lot of Viet Minh. But how many Americans on the left or the right would go out to fight the French or go out to fight the American military in Vietnam unarmed, maybe just on the chance that you'll be able to pick up a rifle and you'll be armed for the next engagement? That is a completely foreign concept. Number one, especially in that setting. And this really is the importance of battlefield recovery. Here, how did the Viet Cong initially get armed? Well, they started ambushing small South Vietnamese patrols. And the North Vietnamese, how did they get armed? They did the same thing. The Viet Minh did it against the French, and then the Viet Cong and NVA did it against the Americans and U.S.-backed South Vietnamese until they were armed, until they had what was then modern weaponry. This is actually, I can't even think of a single guerrilla war that didn't get started this way. But this is how most guerrilla movements become armed: is they ambush small patrols, or small outposts. They take a handful of weapons and go raid an armory somewhere, and go steal a bunch of rifles and outfit their crew. And now, when everyone's outfitted, they can start to attack larger targets and and get access to much greater weaponry for the express purpose just of gaining firearms. Whenever I think about that, like I hear a lot, like especially in Houston or Dallas, about these gun store robberies, or someone breaks into a gun store overnight and they steal, half a dozen guns, 20 guns, whatever. And my first thought was, well, there's another gang that's getting refitted, or there's 12 more 12 more weapons of war out on our streets. I just saw this meme as two MS-13 members, and one said, "Hey, you going to go on the drive-by shooting tomorrow night?" And the other guy says, "No, I'm still waiting for my gun permit." Today, it's gangs getting refitted. I tell you, tomorrow, everyone should watch out for these gun store robberies, because if we ever do get into a position where organized political violence is about to break out, you might expect an increase in gun store robberies or gun store thefts, or whatever you call it. Whatever you call driving a truck through the front of a gun store and 4 to 6, 10 dudes hopping out, bashing in the windows, or trying to get access to firearms and stealing all that stuff and then leaving, or getting access to their cage or their safe or wherever they keep the guns in the back overnight. Once we start seeing that should be an early warning indicator of organized political violence. But I just want to point out, all these people. Yeah, I'm seeing. Yeah, PG says the French resistance did this in World War II. Yeah, Damaki, that's exactly what they did. They went and shot a Nazi who had a pistol or a rifle. They took the pistol or rifle. They gave it to someone else who ran away. They stashed the gun and ran somewhere else. And they just did this repeatedly, and that's how they gain arms. Listen, in low intensity conflicts, in guerrilla wars, this is how these groups arm themselves. So this whole thing about, oh, this group X or Y group is unarmed, or they're not well armed. Well, arming people in this country is not very difficult. So I wouldn't be looking at that and saying that, oh, S group or Y group is going to get run over because they don't have firearms. Well, you can get firearms real easy right now in this country. All right. As a matter of fact, the North Vietnamese, they called every battle a quote unquote hot marketplace, because they could exchange old weapons for new weapons. And in one instance, again, I take this is a story from the book. I take this with a grain of salt. But in one instance, the government of South Vietnam, they had this big display for the press. Here are all the weapons we took from the guerrillas. And there's like garden hose and, clubs or whatever, flintlock rifles, just old, antiquated, less lethal weapon like, a garden hoe or whatever. And the South Vietnamese government said, you should not be afraid to go out and fight the North Vietnamese. You shouldn't be afraid to go out and fight the Viet Cong. Look how poorly they're armed. We took these from the battlefield. It's literally garden hose and flintlock rifles. Well, the unspoken part of that is that the reason why the South Vietnamese got those weapons from the battlefield is because those guerrillas who were previously armed with garden hose threw them away, and they are now armed with rifles. So this is one of those things where, yeah, maybe there's good intentions, but could they have had an ultimate negative effect, trying to propagandize in that way? I think so. I think it was a very poor morale boosting effort, low effort morale boost. Also, just a point I want to make briefly here is that it's interesting reading this book, because just a few months ago, I finished another book about the French experience in Indochina. By the way, what I'll probably do with this show is just talk about the books I'm reading and talk about lessons learned and things I think are important to keep in mind for the next 10 to 20 years as we go through, we're already going through this low intensity conflict of our own here. And by the way, if you want to support the show, certainly would appreciate your support. You can do that at patreon.com/outfront. Kick me a few bucks a month, or however much you think this daily talk is worth. I try to spend 30 minutes a day talking about intelligence, security, low intensity conflict, how to win or at least not lose. Again, that's patreon.com/outfront. Before we move to Q&A, I just want to finish with this one story here. It has to do with propaganda and morale. But there's the Battle of Bao Bank. I guess that's how you pronounce it. The North Vietnamese. It was an American encampment, and the Americans camped there outside of I think maybe even was like a rubber plantation or something like that in Vietnam. And they camped there. And the North Vietnamese, they got word of that because they had scouts and spies everywhere. And this North Vietnamese, I think it was actually like a couple of regiments, marched all night. They marched all night to move on the Americans. They attacked about 30 minutes before dawn. By the way, if you've ever wondered why you have a full stand up, 30 minutes before dawn, it's because doctrinally that's when those kinds of attacks take place. And so at any rate, they attacked. In the first 10 minutes, according to this story, in the first 10 minutes, they completely overran the American communication center. And so after that, the Americans lost the ability to radio back to their division headquarters or whatever it was. And without that ability to radio back, the division headquarters had no idea what was happening. And this is an important point because intelligence is a two-way street. As I say, information is a conflict currency. I want to be the wealthiest man around. I want to make sure that my adversaries are dirt poor. I want to, as much as possible, deprive them of information, especially deprive them of their ability to produce intelligence. And so destroying communications equipment and antennas or whatever else was at that communication center is a very good way to deprive your adversary of information. And that is exactly what happened. The bombers and the jets with the strafing fire that were sent to support that American unit out there, those aircraft were late and ineffective because initially they didn't understand the lay of the battlefield because it's very difficult for them to piece together, what you might call the front line of own troops and front line of enemy troops, the flot and the flet, if you want to talk about it, those doctrinal terms. The Viet Cong claimed that they killed 2,400 American troops. And I read that and I just thought, man, that's staggering. But I went back on Google and looked up a couple of things about the Battle of Bao Bank. And the United States said they lost 146. So you want to talk about how you build morale. And we saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan too. But if you're the Viet Cong and you want to keep morale up, yeah, you just keep telling them how much you're waylaying the Americans every day, and you keep their spirits up, and you convince them that they're winning, and they're going to go out and fight like winners. All right. With that, let's get into some questions. Dustin, if you can help me, please find some questions. Yeah, listen, I changed the name of the show because I stopped using the name Sam Culper, and it was always a pseudonym anyway. The name change, I don't know. I started using my real name like a year ago or so. So, hey everybody, I'm Mike, not Sam Culper. Surprise. All right. So it's nothing new. It's been, a year plus now, maybe. All right. Did you pick up any useful TTPs from the old timer vets that would be useful in a low intensity conflict? I have not gotten there yet. I haven't started to, I don't know. Part of me, I don't want to be a pest, and I don't know how willing those guys are, but things I wouldn't, it's probably the Vietnam guys, having them tell me about what the Viet Cong used to do, or, how they, their take from whatever they still remember, kind of counter guerrilla warfare, I think would be valuable information. There are a lot of books on counter guerrilla warfare. I have, probably a half dozen or 10 that I just haven't started reading yet, but, maybe that's an avenue. Maybe that's an avenue I can take in the future. All right, next question. Earlier this week, you talked about a strategic win might be 51% instead of 100%. How what would a 51% win look like for us in the current political environment of low intensity conflict? Yeah, PG, that's a great question. The context of that is that in many cases there is no perfect victory. Even if you can define what victory is in the first place, I don't think there is a perfect victory for, people say there was even a question yesterday. It was so glowy I had to put my sunglasses on. He said, "Well, when are we going to take back our country?" And listen, man, I think your name was John S. If that was a sincere question, I apologize. And I don't mean to flame you. However, yeah, However, if that was not a sincere question, I don't appreciate those kinds of questions on the show. Uh, you're not gonna bait me into doing anything or saying anything like that anyway, even if I did believe it. So, in terms of us, taking back our country or whatever, uh, I think that ship sailed. The context of the 51% solution is the 51% solution is probably going to be an incredible victory. That's one thing I was thinking about this morning. All these people say, "Oh, take our country back. When are we going to take our country back? It's not going to take our country back." Guys, if you haven't even taken your town back politically, I don't want to hear about what you're going to do, what your plans are, or what your desire is to take back the whole country. Once you get your county elected with very good elected leaders, listen, if everybody did that, we could take back our country. But if you can't even if you can't even put your guys into local politics, if you can't elect your county dog catcher, then I don't want to hear about what you're going to do to take the country back, because so much of this stuff is going to be political anyway. Even GIOP. I mean, I talked about this in previous days. GIOP said the political effort is more important than the military effort. And in low intensity conflict, that's 1000% true. So everything starts with political power. And if you can't develop political power, you're just not going to win. Historically, you're not going to win anything. All right. You won't win a wet paper bag punching contest. I don't know if that was a question or not, but I don't know if I answered it fully. But oh yeah. So the 51% solution for us is carving out for yourself a first world zone and a third world country. And I was actually thinking about that today. How do you keep, how do we define victory for carving ourselves out a first world zone? If I can have my 6-year-old daughter walk 100 yards down the street and I'm not worried about her, that's a victory. 100 yards down the street to her friend's house in our little neighborhood, and I have absolutely no worry or concern over her whatsoever, then I have succeeded in carving out a first world zone in a third world country, because there's not many places left in America where I would be comfortable doing that. So that's what a 51% victory looks like. I just don't think there's going to be 100% victory. History tells us there won't be. History tells us we'll be lucky to escape with a 51% victory. All right. Great question, but next question. We'll do a couple more of these. Mike, I see criminal types waving their guns on a lot of videos. I think the left might be less well armed, but don't you think they might be more likely to shoot? Well, if the actions of these DAs is any indication, then yes, because they will throw every chapter of library, i.e. the book, at guys like Kyle Rittenhouse, which I think was pure self-defense. And these people who firebombed the police car in New York City, they're like getting off on some special probation thing, or they're not getting off, but their sentences are lightly reduced. And we see this all the time. I mean, this Boudin or Chesa Boudin or whatever his name is, the DA out in San Francisco, just got recalled because of how light on crime he was. And yes, I think there absolutely is a political aspect of this. That's why people involved in some of the more heinous activities of the 2020 riots maybe got a slap on the wrist. I mean, I don't know what happened to the people who created the Chaz in this stuff that's going on in like the Red House and like Portland and Seattle. They created their own autonomous zones. Whatever happened to those people? Like, I don't know. Whatever happened to them? If nothing happened, I think that kind of proves the point. So maybe the left would be more willing. I'll tell you, one of the most important things we can understand about the use of hard power in any case is that you have to have soft power to continue hard power. You cannot go out and start exercising hard power. If it were just that simple, it would have probably been done by now. And the left has a lot of soft power. Just think about how they reframed attacking Trump supporters, right? Attacking Trump supporters, the people in the media, a lot of people in the media, a lot of people in government especially, were said, well, yeah, it's okay. It's okay to beat Trump supporters because you're beating fascists. You have to go out and do an anti-fascism, and that's okay. It's completely okay. because, well, that guy's a Nazi. He doesn't have any rights, even though these people were not Nazis. Probably many or most of them weren't even fascists, even though they're accused of being fascist. So, yeah, when you can construct an argument, when you can build an informational frame like that to justify violence and also have it be defended by the media and politicians, yeah, you are winning the soft power fight, and you are also using soft power to enable the use of hard power. So, absolutely, I think that is the case. It will probably get worse as we move closer to 2024, and we haven't even gotten past 2022 elections yet. All right, we'll do one more question, I think, if there is one more question. Mike, do you have a book I can recommend to crayon eaters who just want to get off the bench to understand that this will be won at the strategic level? Great question. One book, if there were one book to do it. Number one, first of all, I would not recommend any of this modern counterinsurgency crap. You got to go back to a book from the 1960s, a book that was published in 1966 called The Art of Counter-Revolutionary War. That is by far the best book I've read about how to win low-intensity conflict. It runs about 200, I think like 200 plus bucks is what I saw it, maybe even 300 bucks. It's bounced somewhere in between there. Because occasionally I'll look on all these used bookstores. I'll look for a copy of it that I can pick up for cheap. I've already got 2 copies of it, but the problem is I highlighted my first one, and I thought, I'd like to keep a copy of this book around like in pristine condition. And when I went back there, it was like 300 bucks. So, The Art of Counter-Revolutionary War. Listen, I'm about to open up the Gray Zone study group, and it's probably 30 pages. I've condensed that 300 plus page book into about 30 pages of notes. And basically it's just it is a chapter by chapter summary. And if you want information on that, I'm not ready to do it just yet, but here pretty soon, probably in like the next couple of weeks, I'm going to open that back up. And if you want more information about that, go ahead and sign up at www.grayzoneactivity.com/dispatch. I'll type it into the chat for everybody. www.grayzoneactivity.com/dispatch. And you got to put the www on there. Ty said he's going to fix it. Ty's going to fix it. I don't have to keep reminding him every 6 months, that kind of thing. So, and then I'll make that available. I'll make that available in an ebook. I'll probably here's the deal. We're going to do at least one book a month of our notes, just a chapter by chapter summary. The same thing I'm going to do with this grasshopper and elephants book, distill the important information. By the way, for those of you just joining, the Viet Cong's account of the last 55 days of the war. Super interesting book so far. Lots of lessons learned. But we're going to be studying me and this guy named Samuel, and that's his real name, who I'll probably be introducing to everyone here at some point in the future. He's a former Army infantry guy. We're going to be doing these book summaries, reading books on low-intensity conflict, stripping out all the lessons learned, things that we can take with us into this decade as things I think will continue to worsen. And we'll do the ebook, we'll do an audio book, and I'll probably have some of these ebooks actually printed out as well and available for purchase. So grayzoneactivity.com/dispatch. Get on my email list. There's 13,000 people on that email list currently. And I'm glad that's 13,000 people who are interested in low intensity conflict. So with that, guys, I think that's going to be the last question. I certainly appreciate it. If you want to support the show, head over to www.patreon.com/outfront. Kick me a few bucks a month or whatever you think this show is worth. And with that, you know what? There's still a few more questions. On here. Do you have any, Dustin? Yeah, it is. It's John J. McEwen is who wrote the book. All right. Sorry. What was that, Dustin? Would it be wise to monitor local critical infrastructure for malicious individuals possibly attempting to do damage? No, I would not spend my finite resources doing that. That really should be a local law enforcement thing. It should be a CISA or CISA thing. It should be a federal thing. I think your time is best spent uh, reading the news or speaking with law enforcement about something that's much more likely in most areas, which is like gang activity or drug activity or things like that. Or go spec out your local extremist groups and get a feel for who they are and what they're about, and try to assess for yourself, how likely it is that they're gonna step off the porch in the next election, 22 or 24. All right. Let's see. Any other questions, Dustin? What is the best way to convince church elders to appoint someone, me perhaps, to be the head of a security team? I don't know. Probably just show them the news and say, uh, look, I'm sure there's all sorts of insurance things, and there's a cost, and then there's a, whatever. But there's a guy named Noel Bishop. He's a former, I'm pretty sure he's a former Special Forces guy. He would be the guy to ask, and maybe even I can interview him on the show. By the way, he pops in and out of the chat. I occasionally see him in here. He would be the guy to ask, because that's his world. It's not my world. Otherwise, I'd probably just show them the news of church shootings and say, like, hey, wouldn't it be better if you had like some off-duty police officers who are concealed carrying in plain clothes in here? Or what if you had some veterans who are, who had the training, had the knowledge, had the sound judgment to sit in the back of the church or wherever, and just as an added precaution. I mean, I think that's just common sense today, and just hope you don't have to use it. Yeah, well, listen, I'll have him on the show. I will bring him on the show. By the way, I'm going to have the guy, or maybe the guys, both of them, I don't know, from Mojave Repeater. They're going to be on the show. Probably, I don't know when, maybe next week, to talk about communications. They've got some interesting setups that I'm trying to build for my own area. All right. With that, guys, that's going to do it for the show. I'll be back tomorrow, 2 p.m. Central Time, Lord willing. Until then, be well and stay out front.